All right, thank you all for joining tonight. This is a Nevada Department of Wildlife program, session 2 for the night and session 5 for Fish Camp Week. Thank you all for joining again. We have an awesome guest speaker tonight, Kevin Netcher. He has been a fisheries biologist for 8 years in Nevada, and now he's working and overseeing the AIS program. So feel free to ask tons of questions. This is Ask a Biologist session. So use the chat, use the Q&A box at the bottom, raise your hand if you want, recognize a lot of the names again, and make sure you have a snack and take notes if interested. And we ask that all questions be kept on topic. So with that, we'll let Kevin take it away.
Yeah, like Abby said, I am Kevin Netcher, and I'm now the Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator for the Nevada Department of Wildlife. Previously, I was a fisheries biologist based out of Elko, Nevada, for 8 years, and now I'm overseeing the invasive species program for Nevada. And that is my contact info if anybody wants to email me with additional questions. So first, we're going to start talking about what is an invasive species. An invasive species can be any type of living organism. It doesn't have to be just a fish. It can be a mammal, it can be a reptile, it can even be bacteria. Some key features about them is that they grow and reproduce quickly, and they're not native to an ecosystem. And to be invasive, they have to cause harm to that ecosystem, whether it be the environment, it can be human health, and it actually can be infrastructure, can be deemed as common, causing harm. So these are some invasive species that you've probably heard about in the news. The upper left is the Japanese giant hornet. The media was calling it the murder hornet. The fish in the upper right is silver carp, is currently in the Mississippi drainage. And this is the fish that you see when boats are going down the river and you see hundreds of fish jumping out of the water. It's that fish right there. On the bottom left, that's a lionfish. And so this is actually an invasive species in the ocean. It's invasive in the Bahamas and the Florida Keys. The snake in the middle is a Burmese python. It's also found in Florida. It's in the Everglades. And the bottom right are feral hogs. And these are mostly in the Southwest United States and Texas. And they're extremely detrimental to agriculture. So aquatic invasive species are just pretty self-explanatory. They're invasive species that are found in aquatic or water. And these species, since they're, especially in Nevada, we don't have a lot of water. So if there's an invasive species, they can cause profound harm to the ecology of our lakes, reservoirs, and rivers. Additionally, they can have pretty significant impacts on infrastructure. Some species can clog dams, they can clog irrigation diversions, and overall just wreak havoc on a system. So these are some of the more common aquatic invasive species that we have in Nevada. Quagga mussels, these are an invasive mussel. They're from the Caspian Sea in Europe. We actually have them in Lake Mead. We have a big program in Lake Mead right now to contain them to that system. We don't want them spread anywhere else. Northern pike. I'm sure a lot of you people have heard about northern pike. They're a pretty popular game fish, but they're also very invasive in certain situations. Common carp is another one. Carp are pretty much everywhere nowadays, but they're very invasive. And then invasive AIS can also be plants. So Eurasian milfoil is actually an invasive plant species. And then another form of AIS is aquarium pets. When people release their unwanted pets anymore, they can become invasive species. So here are just some examples of intentional and unintentional introductions of invasive species. Like we were talking about earlier, it can be releasing unwanted aquarium fish. And some intentional ones are or done by the Department of Wildlife. So for example, stocking non-native fish outside of the range, or trying to provide new fisheries. Some other unintentional could be trailered boats that have plants on the boats. When boats discharge their ballast water, that's how quagga mussels got to Lake Mead. And organisms can escape from hatcheries. So a rainbow trout can escape from a hatchery and end up someplace we don't want it. Although rainbows aren't invasive, that's just an example of how that happen. And a lot of times when people are out fishing and they're using bait, live bait, and then at the end of the day, they just release their bait. So that's the vector for introduction. And then unfortunately, there's a term for what we call a bucket biologist. And that's when people, a lot of times they have good intention, but they are moving species around where they're not necessarily the best species. And so those can become invasive. So these are just some photos of invasive species that are actually taken. Some were taken in Nevada. The pike was not. But the upper left, those are quagga mussels, and that's what they do. They just take over the substrate. That's actually a water bottle that is just pretty much 100% covered in quagga mussels. So those can have very significant impacts to dam operations and marinas and boats, and they're just overall a pretty nasty species. That center fish, so that's a tilapia. That's a, while you have probably eaten tilapia, they're actually native to Africa, but that's a species that can escape from hatcheries. That fish actually came from Lake Mead. It was sampled during a recent survey. The upper right is a carp. Those are, I'm sure a lot of you recognize that. Those carp are pretty much everywhere. But the bottom right, that's actually a Plecostomus. So that also came out of Lake Mead. And that was a fish that somebody got tired of having in their aquarium and they let go. And so it continued to grow and reproduce in Lake Mead. So now I'm going to just go over some of the more common AIS fish species that you're all familiar with. So the first is the common carp. Carp are everywhere. They're native to Europe. They're actually first introduced into Nevada in the late 1800s as a food source for the settlers. Now they're very widespread throughout the state and throughout the US. And why they're so detrimental is because their feeding behaviors, they actually, excuse me, stir up the mud and root in the substrate, and that releases a bunch of excess nutrients in the water, which causes huge algae blooms in this reservoirs and lakes, which fundamentally changes the water quality and limits the survival of native and sport fish species that are more desirable. And one of the downsides of carp is they're very, very difficult to eradicate. It's nearly impossible to get rid of them once you have them. So there's a photo of a carp. I'm sure a lot of you recognize it. They're found in Lake Mead. They're found in the Truckee River. They're found in the Humboldt River. They're very widespread. And unfortunately, now that they're so established, they're virtually impossible to get rid of. We can try to mitigate some of the harm they cause and just try to keep them from spreading to other water bodies that they're not currently present. So that is a northern pike. Currently, they're only found in one place in Nevada, and that's Cummins Reservoir by Ely. And we want to hopefully get rid of them out of that reservoir and keep them from spreading anywhere else. They're native to cold water regions in the northern US, Canada, and Alaska. So the Great Lakes region, all through Canada, all through Alaska, and they're actually native to Europe and Asia as well. They were first introduced into Nevada by the Department of Wildlife back in the 1940s and 1950s to remove unwanted fish species, primarily some native chub species that at that time were deemed to be not desirable. And the big problem with northern pike is they're extremely piscivorous. They're meat eaters. They eat other fish, and that's their primary food source. They don't eat insects or plants or anything. They eat other fish. And so when a pike population takes off, there usually isn't enough prey base in the reservoirs in Nevada. So the pikes quickly eat themselves out of house and home, and then they start to cannibalize each other. because it's the only fish remaining in the water body. So they start eating their own young, and pretty soon the pike population collapses to the point that there's not very many left, and what are there are all very small. And similar to carp, they're very difficult to eradicate. We've been trying to eradicate the pike out of Cummins for going on 10 years now. We're been really successful, but they're still there and we're still working at it.
Can we take a minute and answer one of the questions?
Of course.
Do you know if wildland firefighting activities affect AIS? Such an example would be transport in a helicopter bucket from one water source to another.
Yeah, it's a big topic of discussion in the AIS world. We try to request that firefighters don't get water out of places that we know there's certain AIS species. That's difficult though, because a lot of times they're emergency situations, so they have to get water where water is available. But yeah, it's a big topic that everybody's looking into, trying to solve that problem, and there really isn't a great answer for that yet.
Awesome, thank you.
So these are some pike that came out of Cummins. I know they all look big and awesome and would be fun to catch right now, but in 10 years, they would all be about 12 inches long, and there wouldn't be very many of them, and they'd all be very skinny because right now they're eating well, and you can tell that by these photos, but there's only so much food out there for them.
If people catch them, what are their options for getting rid of them, or carp or crayfish?
How so?
Like eating them or disposing of them properly?
Yeah, so unfortunately you don't want to eat the pike out of Cummins, or the mercury level is too high. We do have a health advisory on that. They're actually illegal to release in Cummins once you do catch one. So you can use them for fertilizer. You could just throw them away if you want. They're not a game fish in Nevada, so there's no limit on them. You can catch as many as you want. Carp, I know people do eat carp. I've never tried it myself, but I hear there's a way to prepare a carp to where it's pretty good. And crayfish, yeah, crayfish are delicious. So we do have some invasive crayfish. Rusty crayfish, for example, is one. That's the species that's in Lake Tahoe that they're trying to remove. And there's actually commercial fishermen for the crayfish right now. They go out and harvest them and sell them.
That's awesome.
And so this last slide is kind of about the pet trade and people releasing unwanted aquarium fish. I know a lot of people think that when they release their goldfish or their mollies, they're just letting them go to be free, but those releases can have some pretty severe implications to some of our native species, especially our native spring fishes in southern Nevada. There, a lot of times they're only found in one location in the world. Release some goldfish or some cichlids, and they start competing with that native fish species, and pretty soon they're wiped out, and they can cause extinctions. So if you have any unwanted fish anymore, just take them back to the pet store, because the pet store will happily resell them, or just contact Endow. The slogan for this is just don't let it loose. So if you have any type of unwanted aquarium fish that you're just tired of taking care of, just give us a call. This, for example, this is a Plecostomus, so this is an aquarium fish. When they're in their aquariums at home, they're like, about 2 inches long. This fish came out of Lake Mead, and it's, as you can tell, larger than the person that's holding its hand, so it's about 10 inches. It's probably reproducing in Lake Mead. It's a non-native species. I mean, this is what can happen when you let them go.
Yeah, so I was at the office and a lady brought in two small ones. I would guess one of maybe their offspring or somebody else's offspring. Um, if they catch them, like kill them, right? Like
Yeah.
don't, please don't put them back.
If you can identify that they are Precocimus. I mean, we do have some native non-game fish that aren't easily identified, but yeah, if you're 100% sure, you know that they're aquarium fish, yeah, kill them or bring them into Endow.
Definitely. And a lot of us have, as you can kind of see from our background, a lot of us have our computers or work phones at home. Even if it's the weekend, send us a message real quick. Let us know. We have urban wildlife up north and down south. Any of us will help you so that we don't continue these efforts. I definitely check my phone on the weekend, so just let us know and we'll help you get a place. We do have some awesome pet stores locally. Actually, one's not far from the office at Trop Aquariums, and they would love to be able to resell this Precocimus.
Yeah, they get 2 for 1 for them. So yeah, you guys have any questions? I know that was a lot and pretty quick. There's the AIS world is huge. There's a lot of different species that we're trying to control or eradicate. Just a lot of information out there. So feel free if you have any questions.
I know one thing too, while we're thinking of questions out there, my first internship was part of the AIS crew at Lake Mead. And at the end of the summers, the vegetation, of course, just gets crazy in those warm temperatures. And one of the bays, well, it was when Boulder Beach was good with water, but the whole thing was full. And I want to say it was the milfoil or something very similar. And what do you recommend people do if it does cover their trailer or boat? Like, how should they get rid of that before taking off?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you bringing that up. So that's what our entire program is at Lake Mead, is to contain invasive species that we know are there from spreading, and also to prevent new introductions into Lake Mead. So have your boat inspected by Endow staff. They'll tell you if you got anything that needs to come off of it. And if you don't have time for an inspection, just make sure that your boat is clean. So there's no visible vegetation on it. There's not a bunch of mud or anything on it as well. That's drained. So all your live wells are drained out, your bilge is drained out. So basically there's no standing water anywhere in the boat. And then it's dry. So the same thing, basically make sure your boat is dry. That's a good way to make sure you're not moving any invasive species with a trailer boat.
Awesome. I'll post the number here in a second too for everybody. Jax has a question. Where would you find northern pike and carp? And I am going to guess in northern Nevada.
So carp, northern Nevada, they're in the Truckee, they're in Lahontan Reservoir, they're in Humboldt Reservoir, they're in Rye Patch Reservoir. I'm sure that they're Mason Valley has them as well, the wildlife management area. There's probably a few other places I'm missing. And then pike are only in Cummins Reservoir, and that's outside of Ely. That's the only place in Nevada we have them, and we're trying to get rid of them.
Keep the questions coming. You can ask them privately. You can direct message us. Just let us know. I'm going to get that AIS boat number. Actually, I'll do the website because depending on what region we're in. And I know the guy off 93 would love to help somebody wash their boat. Thank you for the questions. There's an AIS guy right off Paranagit. Oh, do you want to, oh, sorry, we have a couple questions. I want to talk about Paranagit. How have you been able to study how the carp have wiped out the bass species there.
Piranha, I'm not super familiar with that. That probably goes back to just carp. They're just the way they feed. They just stir up so much mud, and that they just stir up so much nutrients that they just cause those huge algae blooms that kill bass. So that's probably a big part of it. They're also taking up resources, eating resources that are no longer available to the bass. So there's less food. The water quality is not as good. So they're just very, very hard on some of our sport fish.
True.
These smaller water bodies trying to get.
Yeah, very limited. Are there any resources online for identifying common invasive species we have here? I'm sure most of them are really obvious, but maybe some of them aren't.
Yeah, so Bendel has their website. There's some information on there. We're working on updating a lot of that info right now, so stay tuned on that. The Fish and Wildlife Service is a great resource. They're the ones that oversee the Don't Let It Loose campaign. And there's a whole bunch of information on there. There's actually a few nonprofits too that have some very useful websites. The Aquatic Invasive Species Action Network has a website that has a bunch of information on it as well. So yeah, there's a lot of resources out there. Yeah.
I haven't used iNaturalist for that, but have you noticed or heard how they ID invasives?
I'm sure it does. I haven't used it for that either, but I'm willing to bet you it's a feature on there.
And keep our emails and message us. And I do have to say one thing I think people get confused on are razorback suckers and carp sometimes.
Yeah, razorback suckers is a native sucker to the Colorado, and yeah, it does look a lot like a carp. So unless you really know what you're looking at, they can be hard to tell apart.
All right, any other questions? We'll have a good break before the next session too. The next one will be a little bit longer. It's all about the hatcheries. So we have our staff fisheries biologist going into detail on that. All right, thank you. Have a good dinner and hopefully see everybody back at 7 o'clock. Have a good night. Thank you, Kevin, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks everyone.